Hello, I am the awkward GM Corbin, and today we have our lovely guest here for the first time, the gentleman gamer Matthew Dawkins. Please introduce yourself.
Well, you've just done it so well. My name is Matthew Dawkins. I am the creative strategist of Onyx Path Publishing. I oversee various game lines as well, including Scion. They came from the various Earthbane games. Technically, I think Curseborne, although Danielle Lozan is the developer.
Yeah.
And until I suppose we stopped producing them, I oversaw the Chronicles of Darkness games, and we haven't yet finished with all of our World of Darkness run, but I also oversee that one. So I am a fairly busy person. I also have various involvements in the media side of things for Onyx Path, and I am also a writer. I author or co-author as well as develop various books from, as I say, all that they came from. So I've either developed or co-developed. At this point, I have, co-authored lots of games, not just for Onyx Path, but for other companies as well. Chaosium, Green Ronin, Helmgast, and whoever will hire me, really. This is a full-time job, so I take the work wherever I can.
Yeah, it's you're considered a freelancer, correct? Like for all
technically, I
yeah.
mean, I'm still a freelancer, even though I'm on a long-term contract with Onyx Path.
Mm.
We still have the contracts still have start dates and end dates. We've just been fortunate enough to be able to get them renewed.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, it's when you're in this industry, you can't afford to just sit in one place and depend on it for a constant stream of income. You, much like any self-employed job, you need to always be getting your name out there, doing work for new companies, building your reputation, working on different games so you don't get locked into one thing. I always keep busy. And of course, I'm also a professional GM, which is a title I'm
Oh
only
yeah.
really getting used to now, because it always felt like a very strange thing to me. But since I set up my Patreon, I guess a few years ago, I run right now. I run for 9 different groups a month, so 9 different games a month via Patreon that people pay me for, and I still run weekly games for my regular local gaming group. So I run a lot of games as well. Not all of
That's
them paid, but all my Patreon ones are.
that sounds like a very busy life to to have.
Yeah, it is. I don't always get the work-life balance right. I hope I'm a good family man as well, and I do like to pursue various hobbies and interests alongside all of this. But undoubtedly, most of the time I'm working 7-day weeks. If I will be working in the sort of writing and development side of things, Monday to Friday, and weekend evenings and some Monday evenings I'm running games for supporters of my Patreon. So yeah, it can get exhausting. Luckily, I enjoy it, and I think I also have a very supportive base of customers who, if I ever need
Mhm.
to take a break for a month or so, they would probably allow it.
Well, I did want to talk to a project that you're not leading right now, as far as I know, but you have been one of the main contributors of, and that is Storypath Ultra. Am I
Yeah.
correct in saying that?
Yep, I'm not leading Storypath Ultra. You are correct. I think I want to say The World Below was the first book that had Storypath Ultra in. I mean, RPG Anthology, they came from the RPG Anthology, was around that time as well, but World Below was the first one to really apply it. I didn't create Storypath Ultra by any means. While I've had bits and pieces that I've added or amended or discussed with Danielle and Eddie, it's very much a collaborative effort. Eddie is undoubtedly the lead when it comes to the Storypath Ultra core manual. I would still put Danielle as a far more adept system-headed developer than I am. But I don't think I'm bad at that kind of thing. I can create a magic system and that kind of thing with the best of them, and have twisted and turned Storypath Ultra into various forms for the world below. For they came from the RPG Anthology to a degree. Curseborne as well. I've obviously played around with it a bit in that, and Trinity Continuum Steam Wars as well, which I'm co-developing with Eddie, and that's using the Storypath Ultra system, and the upcoming Monster Kingdoms as well, which is another Earthbane game. So yeah, I think I've got the most Storypath Ultra games under my bailiwick right now, so I get to
Yeah.
play with it a lot.
Yeah, I'm very much waiting for that Monster Kingdoms to hear more about that, because that hearing just the announcement, it was similar to At the Gates back in 2023, where it was you just had the name, and you're like, okay, there's a kingdom, there's a monster.
There's lots of kingdoms. Well, there's about 13 or 14 if you include the crumbling empire at its middle. And yeah, they are almost all of them pretty damn monstrous. So the name is appropriate.
We could probably say you're an expert in Storypath Ultra at this point, as far as like various different like I wouldn't say homebrewing because you're developing, but developing these different game lines. You seem to have the breadth of experience going from the various like urban horror with Curseborne to the with the They Came From Anthology, with the more They Came From campiness feel, I would say, is my personal opinion. So like, how is it like building up these? Is there any sort of techniques that other people might want to take advice from, or that you have that you could give to help people with Storypath Ultra?
I think, well, Storypath and Storypath Ultra are both very good modular systems. It's something I often encourage people to do. I think players, story guides can approach a game, they'll see the size of the core rulebook and they'll immediately think, not for me, or they will look at a system and it might be unfamiliar to them and they'll think, I can't digest all of this. And the fact is, whether you're looking at Scion or whether you're looking at They Came From or The World Below or Curseborne, the fact is you don't have to learn all of anything. Storypath Ultra and Storypath Classic, I suppose, when taken from a They Came From standpoint, what I always tell people is, for your first session, just concentrate on the dice pool. D10 dice pools, 8s, 9s, and 10s is what you're looking for your hits. And any additional hits you achieve beyond the difficulty, you can use to make your roll more spectacular, your action more spectacular. You do that, add some quips, add some cinematics. That's all you need to know. Next session, now we introduce enhancements and complications. Third session, now we might start talking about scale if it's original Storypath, or advantage if it's Storypath Ultra. We might talk about, we might start getting into the sheer variety of combat tricks or tags and status effects and area effects and so on and so forth. You don't need to deliver it all at once. And it's one of those things where if you're a story guide, especially, preparation is key. I don't mean writing out reams and reams of notes before your game, but have an idea of the scenes you want to play, because that means, okay, this session we've got coming up will be an investigation session, or a half of it might be. So that's the part of Storypath I need to learn, or I need to refresh myself on. But because it's so modular, that rule system is not something you need to keep in your head at all times. You just need to refer to it when you need it. So in terms of building up a game, to actually circle back to the point of your question, you just look at what the players are going to need from that gaming experience. I would suggest that, in a way, They Came From is the most... In a way, it's the most complex Storypath or Storypath Ultra game, because it has all these bells and whistles, little gimmicks that make it a cinematic RPG. but some of the time, those bells and whistles are just renamed assets from other games. You know, you've got your cinematics. That is kind of narrative control or whatever I think it's called in Trinity, or your points of inspiration and so on. You know, these things can kind of be swapped and changed and renamed and applied. But the point is, yeah, you build from the basics and you expand as you go on. You focus, you spotlight the parts of the system you want to use for any given session, and then you don't use them again. It's very unlikely you will have a session where you have to use all of Storypath Ultra at the same time, or within a 3-hour or 4-hour scope, typically. But yeah, I've been very gratified by some of the testimonials. You can read some of them on Curseborne.com. We've had from some of the playtests we've been doing with Curseborne, and so therefore with Storypath Ultra, the response, unsolicited, that we've been getting from people who have not played Storypath Ultra games before is incredibly complimentary about how intuitive the system is, how deep the system can go if you want it to, how things like enhancements and complications and so on actually seem to make sense to people who have never used them before. So all of that is good to see, and it means I think we're going in the right direction with building the system that way.
Totally. I've played the Curseborne Ashcan twice now. I'm planning on playing a third time this weekend, actually.
Oh wow! Add Red Riding Hood to mix things up. And,
yeah,
and the Mad Hatter, given that I added him to blog recently.
I'll have to do that next time I'm running it. I'm playing it this time to get a handle on it. But
I see.
My players were they'd come from Chronicles of Darkness and Scion, and they both really enjoyed how the system ran. And with my second time running, it was a lot easier. I got the handle of it better.
One thing, and Rose Bailey said this, I think on RPGNet, and it's something I very much agree with. Rose Bailey is mostly known in Onyx Path circles as one of the Chronicles of Darkness developers, though she's worked on many more games than that. And something she said for her appreciation of Storypath is that she enjoys a game where essentially additional successes or additional hits, in Storypath Ultra's case, can actually be translated into something. The problem with Chronicles of Darkness or World of Darkness, so storytelling or storyteller, or Shadowrun, which is where it all derives from with the dice pool system, is that you have a difficulty, and if you hit it and if you exceed it, it doesn't really matter how much you exceed it by. You just hit the difficulty. So you've performed your action. Now you've just got all these dice lying around and they don't do much. Now, in Chronicles of Darkness, there's one distinction. I think if you get 5 successes, that's an exceptional success. But that means anywhere between 1 and, 2, 3, and 4 are basically redundant. With Storypath Ultra, it's such a simple feature of the system, but the idea that every additional hit can buy you something, more or less, with tricks, especially in the realm of combat, means that the number of dice you're rolling matters. The number of enhancements you have matter, because now these can be translated into ways of making your action more spectacular, more interesting. You can basically get more bang for your buck.
I've been enjoying that with the system as well. In regards to like the tricks, I'm really excited with how the investigation and the social system, the intrigue system, I think, have changed. Influence, with Storypath Ultra, in that now I feel more of that my roles actually matter a lot more, because before, if it were too complex, I sort of would shut off and end up like removing the system. But with Storypath Ultra, it's a lot more streamlined with the tricks. So it's like, it's still just a skill roll. I don't have to be throwing everything at the, like, doing complex mathematics in my head.
Yeah.
I just have to be like, oh, you rolled your influence roll. Now you can use a trick because you rolled so many dice to better the attitude of the person that you're talking to, or establish a bond, or any of those things.
Now, I think if I had a wish list, there would be like a cheat sheet for players, which has a list. It's a one-pager. You've got a list of combat tricks, influence tricks, and investigation tricks, all on that. So you've got something nice and quick you can refer to. Because something I found with They Came From was stunts, which were, of course, the predecessors of tricks in the original Storypath. I put a section in the They Came From character sheet for favored stunts, and not many people used it because stunts are supposed to be flexible. You buy them when you want them. But my idea behind it was, there's quite a lot of options in the game, and being able to retain them if you don't have the book in front of you can be tricky. So noting down the ones you like to defer to, for me, seemed logical. Now, people didn't do that in my research. So I think having something accessible to players where they can easily just figure out quickly what tricks are available to me is something that appeals. And even going beyond that, if you looked at it from an electronic standpoint, something as simple as you roll your dice, the results come out, it tells you you've got this many hits. These tricks are illuminated, these ones are grayed out because you can't afford them. You know, you buy a 2-hit trick, you've only got 1 hit left. Now there's only the 1-hit tricks are left. That's very much my imagination running wild, because that's telling me that's what I would really like to see. I don't know how feasible that is, but I think tricks are so much fun. I want them to be as accessible as they can be to the players who are supposed to be using them.
Yeah, if I were to have a game master screen or story guide screen, I would have tricks just on one side of it.
Yeah,
for the entire thing, just for myself. I do that for my players, though. I give them I have Google slides of the quick reference for stunts for myself. So I give it to them, and they're like, oh, great. Now I can, like, not have to remember every single trick that's coming down the pipe and everything.
Yeah.
So I second that motion entirely. So with this, with Storypath Core Manual, Storypath Ultra Core Manual, sorry, I misspoke there. There's been a lot of advice on how to make your own system, or your own, like, version of the game. We did sort of get confirmation, I think, on the Discord that like how to create your own templates might not be included in it, or at least might be like errated or something. Is there anything, like, advice you could give about sort of creating a template for Storypath Ultra, like for, say, a cursed in Curseborne or talents in Trinity?
Well, in effect, what you're looking at there is actually, it's a very good question, because no, at present there are no templates, because the whole idea is you basically build the game you want at the power level you want, and it's tricky to prescribe, because right now with the Storypath Ultra games we have out there, they all aim at a different power level, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
A World Below character template is very different to a Curseborne character template, which is very different to where They Came From character template. They don't necessarily fit in a niche, they just suit the games they have been made for. But you kind of need to take your lead from those existing games and determine the power level of the game you're looking for. So as an example, and I may get some of these figures wrong, but I'll use them as ballparks. If you go for something like The World Below, and I think this was a previous iteration of The World Below, but the sort of point I'm about to make still stands. The World Below is the only Storypath Ultra game where you get to choose from any one of your paths to make it major right now. So in Curseborne, you have a choice of 2 paths that you can make major, and the other one will always be minor. I believe, and I could be wrong in At the Gates, I certainly know this would be the case in RPG Anthology if we made it fully Storypath Ultra. There is only 1 path that is major, and the other 2 are minors. Now, take World Below, which is arguably, I suppose, in this respect, the most complex. You choose which path is major, and therefore that earns you a certain value of attribute points and skill points more for that path than you get for your 2 minor ones. Now, that is so far so similar as the other ones.
Mhm.
However, because the World Below also has a magic system, and there are abilities or powers tied to every single path. So you have your theses tied to your dawn path, you have your syntheses tied to your dialectic, and you have your sorceries tied to your calling. If you chose your dialectic as your major path, you will have more dots to spend on syntheses than on these 2. If you chose calling, you'd have more dots to spend on sorceries. Now, this creates an interesting balance issue, because demonstrably sorceries are more powerful in terms of their immediate use, but depending on the kind of character you want to play, theses are always on, syntheses tend to be a once per session. So you can kind of customize the route you want your character to take, the kind of experience you want to play as a player, by which path you choose as major. Now, the reason I go into all of this is because that is a very different setup to Curseborne, as an example, where the magic system isn't nearly so granular. And the World Below is deliberately granular. I don't mean that in a negative way, in the sense that you choose exactly what you want. Curseborne is you choose which one your path is. However, that is not going to have, whether it's your lineage or your family, but that's not going to have any impact on the number of spells you have access to. So, all of that said, what that informs me about creating templates for Storypath Ultra is we could certainly do it, but I am not sure. I would need to see lots of examples, I think,
Mm.
to see if that actually tells me anything about a gameplay loop or arc. And it would probably need some rigorous testing, because I certainly rigorously test the games I develop. Rather than just describing that this is going to be a superhero game, therefore you must get X number of gifts, X number of edges, and your attributes must be blah blah blah. That for me feels quite arbitrary. You would need to
Yeah.
spend a lot more time, and it almost feels like a completely different book. If I'm quite honest, it's like a where Storypath Ultra core manual is, and it is the system presentation. You'd almost be looking at trying to think how I would classify it. I suppose it's almost RPG Anthology or Mythic Shards like, in the fact that you would be presenting different genres, but you wouldn't be able to limit it to just presenting an interesting setting like we are doing in the Storypath Ultra core, where, of course, there's going to be 3 separate games. You would need to fully flesh out character creation for each one of these to demonstrate what the templates would look like. It would be an interesting challenge. It would be something I would be interested in looking into. And it's definitely something I recommend people who watch this submit as feedback if they're interested in it for Storypath Ultra Core, because who knows, Eddie and Danielle may have a different take than me. When I get into game design mode, I start running through the various permutations in my mind, but honestly, once I talk to the 2 of them, we can usually come to some kind of solution. It might be something we could provide in the core manual as additional text, but I feel like it would be a substantial volume of text, is
Yeah.
my inkling, but they may disagree.
Yeah, guidance on it would be amazing to see, even if it's just a little bit. I mean, for instance, Curseborne, comparing Curseborne to say Trinity Continuum. Trinity Continuum, you have the resource of like inspiration, I
Hmm.
believe, and the different facets. Whereas
Yeah,
with Curseborne, instead of having that resource just be like a dot on your sheet, you now have those curse dice that you're managing and so many
yeah,
different things. It's an interesting take because we do see in the core manual, from what I've seen, is like it mentions using a resource from a template to like power an ability or something,
yeah.
but there's nowhere that says exactly how to determine that, or maybe like just just like if you want a low power game, have smaller amount of points. If you want a
I mean,
higher
I would
one, have
say
a better
that yeah, that's the logical
one.
takeaway. Uh, the fact that there isn't a, for low power games, you want a pool of 3; for mid tier games, pool of 5, and whatever. Um, it's I would be hesitant to state that again without some kind of
Yeah,
play testing, because I don't know
yeah.
offhand that, let's say, a pool of 3 would make a game feel low powered, if that
Oh
makes
yeah.
sense. It again depends on the gameplay loop you're looking for, how
Oh,
often these points refresh, um, what kind of traits are powered, or what kind of abilities are powered with them, what kind of abilities aren't powered by them. Um, and so, yeah, when you start getting into things like mana points, as they historically used to be,
mhm.
uh, it, it's an interesting thing to explore. And I'm always up for talking about these kinds of things, but as you can tell, I get quite into the weeds of I, I can absolutely see how they can work, but I
Yeah,
can also see how they might not, or how just presenting this as again, what might feel to me like an arbitrary distinction of low tier, mid tier, high tier,
yeah,
that may reassure a reader who wants to create their own game and say, well, it says in the book that this is low tier, so that's fine. But I would be unprepared to state that unless I was sure I knew what
yeah.
I was talking about. Because, yeah, I don't want to just provide information for the sake of it.
That's very understandable. You're essentially giving giving GMs enough rope that they don't hang themselves with it. Essentially,
Well, yeah, yeah. There's a secondary point to it, and that is that as there is no Trinity Continuum Storypath Ultra game out yet,
yeah,
there is no Scion Storypath Ultra game out yet either. Uh, we need to have a view, or certainly I feel like we need to have a view of how games like that will develop
yeah,
using Storypath Ultra. We can't be in a position, or we should strive to not be in a position. There's no way we will always get things right, but we should strive to not be in a position where we've stated something, let's say in the Storypath core manual, where as an example, let's say we say that at ultra low power, when you're just lucky humans, you get 1 mana point to spend on powers during per session. And let's say we get to a Trinity Continuum core revised, or whatever it would be called if we do one,
mhm,
and it transpires that our base level talents need more than one. Let's say we do another Scion Origin, and it turns out we need more than one, or one is actually somehow more than we need.
yeah,
It's You kind of need to future proof, and extending too far by I promise I'm not shooting down the idea of templates, because again I see the worth of them, but yeah, you kind of need to safeguard your future products by not committing to a certain to use a mage word, a certain paradigm of this is how an X game must look. This is how a Y game must look mechanically. Because if we then release a game that doesn't conform to that,
Mhm.
I don't know what harm it could do. Probably very little, but I wouldn't feel good about it, and that's
Um,
important to me.
Understandable. If you're looking to make a website, look no further than Shaw Web Design. They're sponsoring this video, and they even made me a website, though I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Please check it out in the link below, and please leave a comment telling me what I should do with this website. I'm very thankful that the Storypath Core Manual isn't the first thing coming out of the gate for Storypath Ultra.
Yeah.
Because with this, you've kicked the tires, as it were. You've done the work on the world below. They came from the RPG Anthology and At the Gates as well.
RPG Anthology has had less tire kicking because it is ultimately just using a quick play version of Storypath. But the Ultra Appendix is in there should anyone wish to, I guess, update any They Came From game they've got. The World Below and Out the Gates, I can't speak for Out the Gates with Danielle, but I know the World Below has, through its various permutations and my play testing it and finding all kinds of things out from players, that has had a significant impact on how Storypath Ultra has evolved, because that's what playtesting does. I think every game designer should try to playtest their games or have other people playtest their games. That's a much better thing.
Oh, definitely.
And to find out what works and what doesn't. It isn't necessarily about rules being broken. It can be things like, which power do people always go for? Which powers do they always avoid? And sometimes it's the reason is something as simple as, it was written in such a complex way I didn't understand how to use it, so I avoided it. Other people are going to say Magic Missile is clearly the most powerful first level spell, so I'm always going to go for Magic Missile. So,
Yeah, it's interesting to see the process for you guys with the development for, like, so one thing I've seen with other game systems, and to an extent some of your own systems at Onyx Path, is like, as the game like first comes out with the first edition, you see it slowly evolve over the course of development, and then once it gets into second edition, all those changes that were towards the end of first edition that some people are like, well, it doesn't really gel with the stuff at the beginning, or it's too powerful than the stuff at the beginning, suddenly gets blended together into a nice, like, more cohesive format.
Yeah. It's a natural iterative process. Every single edition of every single game, well, I say that, most editions of most games will follow that kind of arc. And I referenced Magic Missile. I recall when I first started playing D&D way back when, which was at the tail end of AD&D second edition, that the changes to third edition had already started by the end of second edition. In some cases, they were quite subtle. But for me, the jump to third ed wasn't terribly pointed. But if you look back at AD&D second edition core manual, the player's handbook, the rules are very, very different, jarringly different. And yeah, the same applies. I mean, whether They Came From games, every They Came From game is system-wise an improvement on the last. I think every They Came From has its own selling point. I don't consider any of them bad or broken or anything like that, but I can definitely look at Classified and Cyclops' Cave, and I could definitely look at RPG Anthology, and I can say, well, we streamlined the system by this point, we've cut away the bits no one was using, we've worked out that our referencing this, that, and the other in Beneath the Sea and Beyond the Grave, for examples, has proved redundant, to the point that, yeah, it's iterative. We work out what works and what doesn't, and the only way you can do that is, yeah, playtesting is fantastic. Always do it, but ultimately you'll never find out what's right until it's exposed to the market and customers give their feedback for good or ill.
I always suggest to people, to listeners or people watching right now, is to give the manuscripts a shot when they come out, and always provide feedback to
Oh
Onyx
yeah,
Path when you do so, because getting those manuscripts early, that's the entire book for the most part, unless anything changes in the final release. But you can actually have a say in how stuff gets presented, and maybe a rule that's a little that developers have figured out and have read like a million times might not be clear to someone who's a beginner.
yeah. I remember somewhen during the Curseborne development, we were talking in team about references to damage and health and injuries, and how there was often quite a lot of crossover between all three of them. And to the point that by the time the Curseborne manuscript will get to backers of the Kickstarter in October, I don't think we reference health anywhere. I think it's all injuries. I think we just get rid of the word health because it was just serving a redundant purpose.
Yeah.
And damage is not necessarily injuries, but if you inflict injuries, that is direct injury damage, if that makes sense. But my
Yeah.
point being that we found out through errata and through playing that these were ultimately redundant terms, either referring to the same thing or confusing the matter. Sometimes we will deliberately choose, on the same note, different terminology for the same thing across different games.
Yeah.
So we've got some status effects, some area effects, and tags and things like that, because those three kind of tie into each other, that are more or less the same between all of our Storypath Ultra games. But we might change the name to be more tonally correct for the game we're talking about. I think I've got one called Vertiginous in The World Below. I like the word vertiginous, but I also love the idea, but it's something that's going to occur in The World Below. You're standing at the edge of a chasm. All of a sudden, the ground feels like, it's rising up to meet you. And I think we might just call it something. I'll use much more plain English in some of our other games, because not everything needs to be as arcane as The World Below. I like how arcane The World Below is, but not everything else needs to mirror that. Not everything needs a path called your dialectic, for instance.
In specific to the world below, what sort of systems have you expanded upon that are different from the core manual of Storypath Ultra? Like, I imagine there's some changes to fit the theme of the world below.
Yeah, sorcery is the big one. Settlement building and maintenance and defense is, I guess you could call it an ancillary one. Because the settlement side is still definitely Storypath Ultra, but because we wanted to call upon the idea of, I guess, the classic fantasy games, there's also a lot of table dice rolling, for random events. That's not strictly Storypath Ultra. It's got nothing to do with Storypath Ultra, but the effects you generate from those tables will then be translated through Storypath Ultra to see how they affect you and your settlement. Sorceries are, I would suggest, the most interesting for the world below take on Storypath Ultra, because again, we still use to cast a sorcery in the world below, a fixed one or structured sorcery. You will have a dice pool. The difficulty will always be 1, unless it's being affected by where you are in the world below for some reason. And with the number of hits you achieve, just as if it were in combat or an investigation, you can, on 1 hit, congratulations, you hit the difficulty. On additional hits, you can buy sorcery tricks, and each spell has its own set of possible tricks in the write-up that you can spend additional hits on. But beyond that, and that's just the structured sorcery, because then you have the untethered sorceries, your chaotic magic, essentially wild magic, where you can freeform construct your own sorceries. I saw a lot of people asking whether Curseborne was going to go very Mage the Ascension or Mage the Awakening, and I want to create whatever sorcery I can. It isn't, not at this point anyway. I can't speak for the future, but the World Below already does that. The World Below has already given you the tools for using Storypath Ultra to freeform a magic system, complete with a breakdown of what each component of a spell does to either increase the difficulty or add complications. Of course, what the World Below does is if you don't buy off all said complications, you get a chaotic backlash, a retaliation. That will be something, not always disastrous, but it was always something chaotic. In your games of Mage, let's say, you may not want to go with a chaotic retaliation, a paradox backlash, a wild magic effect. You might want to go for some other kind of negative impact should you not buy off the complications. But the point is, the system is still there. That if I come in at a base level and I want a spell that affects someone at close range, that heals, and that I don't know, and affects anyone at close range. And now I've expanded it. So first step is range, then I want effect, and then I want any additional effects. I am building levels of complexity, and that's all laid out in the World Below sorcery chapter. So it all still fits within Storypath Ultra. But it isn't a system that is needed for every Storypath Ultra game, so it doesn't appear. Even in At the Gates has a very different magic system, and I imagine Monster Kingdoms will have a very different magic system, because magic is a very flexible thing, and it adds flavor to each game, the way you present it.
It's interesting because you've said before the modularity of Storypath Ultra, and I could definitely see if someone wanted to bring something into, say, make their own game, or maybe adjust Curseborne or At the Gates, they could take that system, the chaotic magic system that you have, and put it into it, maybe for their home game, and just to give it a shot, or even their own setting. And I like that about the game, the system itself, is how I imagine there's a world or a dimension where Storypath Ultra Core Manual was bigger and it was able to fit everything. Because I mean, a lot of people were, I heard they were like, oh, I wish the settlement rules were in Storypath Core Manual, and if you want, you can go and get the World Below and you'll have a basis for that and you can build it up and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice that someone might want that rule in Storypath Core, a Storypath Ultra Core Manual.
I've been making that same mistake all podcasts, and I've been cringing every time I miss the Ultra.
That's all right. The Storypath Ultra Core Manual. Yeah, it's nice that someone would want that. However, yeah, if we went through absolutely every permutation of what Storypath Ultra could be used for, and this is a positive, we would have a book larger than Exalted 3rd edition. And that's because Storypath Ultra is a very flexible system you can do a lot of things with. But we have to also draw a line somewhere. And if I were to compare it to a book like Mithras or Fate or Basic Role Playing or the Chronicles of Darkness Blue Book as examples, those books aren't overwhelmingly chunky, because all of a sudden there is an appearance, an aesthetic question in play, which is, would someone pick a system book up if it was, that thick? And yeah. I don't think many people would, because I think, well, I don't want to have to read all of that. But if you've got the basic Storypath Ultra system, along with a selection of expansions, which we know are in there, and 3 games showing you how to use the system, I think that's a pretty good offering for a rule book.
Is there anything more you'd like to say so that if people are a little bit on the fence with Storypath Ultra right now, that you might want to say to help convince them to break into it?
Do I have a sales pitch? Well, I think the greatest asset Storypath Ultra has is its flexibility. The fact that we have demonstrated at Onyx Path that this system can be used in its prior iteration and its current one for games of a contemporary, a sci-fi, a horror, fantasy, and with RPG Anthology, many, many, many more genres, and it still holds up. It For my money, doesn't feel out of place in any of these games, and it takes a simple twist of the rules to turn it from something heroic to something grim and nihilistic. I saw on the Onyx Path Discord for a while there were some people who were saying, "I don't understand why the closer you get to death, why do you become more effective in Storypath Ultra?" Well, there's a few reasons. One, and I saw both of these argued. One is that it is more dramatic and heroic. The closer you are to death, the better you do, and therefore you're also tempted to perform riskier acts the closer you are to death because you think you will succeed at them, but of course then you might push yourself closer to death because you're taking risks. And the other one is quite simply, if you want to take a realism approach, as people get injured, quite often the adrenaline kicks in and they will start pushing themselves beyond their normal limits. I mean, from a D&D perspective, it's almost a berserker's rage kind of, your stats go up and then they drop down. So if you've lost that health, all of a sudden you might pass out. Now, I heard plenty of people, or saw plenty of people say, I prefer a system where you lose dice as you get more and more injured. Well, and I hate to fall back on this old canard, but the fact is, if that is the way you want to do it, the system won't break. You
Mhm.
can do that. You can absolutely change your injury system so that your characters grow increasingly debilitated the closer they get to death. I recommend playing the game as it's written first. See how it works, especially that injury system in conjunction with status effects, because then you might start noticing why this improving dice pool is so effective. But if it's not for you, it's so simple to just change pluses to minuses. And
Yeah,
I appreciate that's not the sales pitch. The sales pitch was to say how flexible it was, but I think that is a decent demonstration of, with a simple adjustment, you can change the tone of a Storypath Ultra game incredibly simply, and the thing does not break.
just because something as simple as that isn't in the core manual doesn't mean you shouldn't give it a shot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think I could be wrong. I think They Came From was the only original Storypath game that has the additional dice as you get closer to death.
Hmm.
I think it was I created that for They Came From to symbolize cinematic characters who are being shot at, like in war movies where you've got the cigar chomping Sarge who is, basically advancing on the German machine gun nest as the Nazis are firing upon him, and despite the fact bullets are taking chunks out of him, he's just getting faster and faster, and then he gets up, whack, and then you find out he's died. I mean, it's very Saving Private Ryan. I think that very thing happens,
Yeah.
more or less. And so that made a lot of sense for me from a They Came From perspective. But then the other developers on other Storypath games started saying, we should use this for our Storypath game because it makes your health less abstract. It makes
Mhm.
your injuries more heroic. It compels people to take action because they think they can get away with it now.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm glad that has sort of carried over to the totality of Storypath Ultra.
It's a great it's a great thing when other game developers look at your stuff and just go, "Yeah, let's take that. That's a good idea. You've solved it."
Oh yeah, I'm much happier with that happening within Onyx Path
Yeah.
than finding out another company has taken an idea of
Oh.
mine. But
It's different when it's inspired versus stolen.
I say that I have no doubt that I have taken things from other games by other companies. I know when I worked on V5 for Paradox, that it was Ken Height who said we really need to have lore sheets in Vampire the Masquerade. And there were people on the team who said, we don't know what lore sheets are. And he said, Weapons of the Gods, that was the RPG that introduced lore sheets. And he said, there's no trademark on them. There's no copyright or anything like that. We can just use lore sheets. And so lore sheets showed up in the World of Darkness as well. So yeah, these things, in that case, they were literally lifted name and all from another game. In other cases, you'll find things that are inspired by the settlement building and maintenance system in the world below is at least spiritually inspired by Pendragon and the A Song of Ice and Fire RPG, Houses of the Blooded, that kind of thing. So yeah, we get ideas from all over the place. Stealing is pretty natural, I think, in the creative world.
I get that. and so we're coming up on time in just a little bit. I am a little bit weird in doing these interviews in that I do them a little backwards, where I ask questions about your history and how you first got started in game design towards the end. So, like, how did you get started with game design in general?
Ooh, well, with game design, that's a good question because I tried multiple times to become a freelance writer. Well, not to become a freelance writer, that's not true. To write for White Wolf of old, just sending in random pitches every few years or so from about the year 2003 onwards, and never heard back. The first time I actually got selected to write on something, I often forget about this, was on the Vampire the Masquerade trivia game, which was in something like 2006, 2007, and was never published, which is good because it wasn't a good game.
Okay.
I wrote the Malkavian questions for that. But after that, there was a 6 or 7 year gulf of silence. And I backed Wealth the Apocalypse 20th Anniversary Edition as a consulting developer so that I could actually finally figure out what I need to start writing to get noticed. Essentially, what do you need to write to end up in an RPG? So I became a consulting developer on Book of the Worm, 20th Anniversary Edition. Stu Wilson was the developer of that book, and God bless him, he was a fantastic mentor without even intending to be, because by being a consulting developer, I had access to the red lines, the editing process, which meant I could see the writer's first drafts, I could see what the developer wanted from those writers in red lines, and I could see how they changed their work in the final draft. I basically treated this consulting developer tier as a one-off creative writing lesson. And it paid off because I used what I learned from that to then write a successful pitch for Mummy the Curse, and ended up writing on a Mummy book. I got hired based on a pitch I sent in. And this was about 2013. And subsequent to that, I basically worked part-time in game writing while doing my full-time job. At the time, I was a trainer. For about 4 years, until eventually I had so many contracts in RPGs and board games and so forth that I could give up training and become a full-time game designer, writer, developer. As of 2017. So I guess I've been doing it that long, and that's my journey. The first game I designed was They Came From Beneath the Sea. That's the first one I sort of built from the ground up. Originally, it was going to have its own system. Rich and I discussed but with Storypath, which was being used for Trinity and Scion at the time. And I don't think they had come out at the time where we were discussing it. because I remember reading the manuscript for the Trinity Continuum core and thinking, oh, wow, this system is really good. I don't actually need to create my own one. So in the end, yeah, I adopted the Storypath system for They Came From, which was probably more complex than it needed to be for They Came From. And this is what I meant about They Came From has essentially become streamlined the more it's gone on. At first, we took Storypath wholesale, and then we chopped that bit out, that bit out, that bit. Because again, it's modular; it doesn't break as you lose more and more of it. And yeah, since then, it's been all kinds of games for all kinds of companies.
And how does the Gentleman Gamer YouTube channel factor into all this?
I think the gentleman. So that's a good question. Not many people ask me about that these days. So good question. So before I started writing, I made videos about RPGs. The reason I started making videos about RPGs, RPG reviews, really, in about 2009, I want to say, I think I started. It might have been, yeah, I think 2009. Is because I was looking for a review of a game I love called Slay Industries. It's an excellent dystopian sci-fi RPG I recommend to anybody. SLA Industries, and I found a video on YouTube that was someone reviewing Slay Industries, and when I got to the end of the review, I thought that was good, but I think I could actually make a better presentation than this person because they were sort of sat in a dark room like I am now. They weren't speaking with much confidence. It was a bit rambly. I know I'm very rambly, but basically full of arrogance, I decided I'd record myself doing some RPG reviews. And I thought, I'll take off. I'll be the next big thing. And for a while, the RPG world, because it was very niche back then, there was no Geek and Sundry, no Critical Role or anything like that. My channel was pretty big. I went from RPG reviews to doing things like video game Let's Plays. I then started interviewing people. I sort of pulled Mark Ryan-Hagen out of the wilderness and then ultimately pushed him back. I got to know the various developers or some of the developers at Onyx Path before I started working for Onyx Path because I interviewed them on my channel. And so this is how I got to know people like Rich, for that matter. I think I interviewed him before I ever spoke to him professionally. And the channel has, I guess, waxed and waned, mostly waned over the last 5 or 6 years because I've spent so much time writing, I just don't have time to create videos. But additional to that, I no longer review role-playing games in a traditional sense because I work with these people. I think it would be a massive breach of etiquette to do a review where I say, this piece of this game is absolute crap. But not that I ever did that. This is why it was called The Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. I didn't come up with that name. A viewer came up with that name because I was always being so positive about the games I was reviewing. But if I said, I don't like this, that could be the person I'm working with tomorrow. And while I'm sure most people could take it on the chin, some people wouldn't. So, yeah, it just didn't seem like a polite thing to do. So, yeah, I stopped reviewing. I occasionally did videos doing deep dives, like The Gentleman's Guide to Vampires, of course, and Pentech's Guide to Werewolves, which were probably my most popular things. And doing more setting-based stuff. The last couple of weeks, I've been starting up again, and in part, it's to build momentum for Curseborne. I know I've got 28,000 odd subscribers, and if I can turn even a small fraction of them onto Curseborne by talking about it, that's worth doing. But I'm aware that I can't do that by just coming out the gate and making videos about Curseborne. Because most people who subscribe to my channel want World of Darkness. So I've got to talk about World of Darkness, but talk about Curseborne in relation to World of Darkness to start turning people's heads, if you see what I mean. So it's a steady process,
Yeah, I try to, whenever I talk to people who are very diehard Chronicles of Darkness fans, I always say, listen, if you're fine with Chronicles of Darkness and you don't want to try Curseborne, that's fine. But if you want to try something new, get out of your comfort zone, like, yeah,
Yeah,
go for it. Like,
exactly.
don't like be aware it's around if you want it. I don't know. You've definitely inspired me with how you ran your channel over the years. I was sort of like a passing subscriber on it, so I'd be like dipping into different videos that you've done. I can't remember any specifically, but like sort of like the vampire overview stuff you did in the past, and stories. I always love hearing the stories of those games, and that's kind of what inspired me to make my channel in the way it is.
Oh well, I'm glad because now here we are.
And I don't do reviews either. I do overviews because I think people should learn a system and be able to figure out like if it's for them and stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't think I don't think reviews really make a huge heap of sense for RPGs because they are such a subjective medium. A game is either good or bad based on the people you're playing with, the person running it, the story they're telling, how well the system is presented to you, and how well you get on with it. And everyone's tastes are going to be different. Now, a game can be badly written. It can be badly laid out. The art could be terrible. That's all true. The subject might be edgelordy crap. It could be bigoted nonsense. You know, it could be any of those things. And that, yes, does objectively make a game bad. But the vast majority of games aren't. Most games are artistic pursuits, creative pursuits by game designers who have got half a clue. And as long as the game hangs together, it doesn't necessarily all need to run like clockwork and present some interesting ideas. At that point, being able to grade it, being able to say this game is excellent and this game's only good and this one's okay and this one's poor and this one's bad, it becomes so vague. I think all you can really do is say, I liked it and here's why. And you might want to say, and this is why I didn't like it. But I would always couch that with, but you may have a different experience because there's no point being evangelical about these things. It's, you know, it serves absolutely zero purpose unless your channel is based around sort of rage baiting people. And I can't stand that kind of RPG media or any kind of media. I've never liked the sort of angry video game nerd style of, and I'm sure James Rolfe is a perfectly lovely person, but the idea of for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to scream and shout and swear at this game.
I get that.
It's
It's
just
a
not entertaining for me.
No, it's not. And I find myself getting into that tightrope sometimes on that. Because it's like sometimes I do bash Dungeons and Dragons a bit, but I do appreciate it for what it is and stuff like that. But like, it can be fun. It can be weird how like a general like trying to make it so that it's like, yeah, I'm criticizing, but I'm also not like putting anyone down or anything.
I think what makes Dungeons and Dragons so interesting to me as a game designer is that I completely agree that it is actually a good entry level game because mechanically, objectively speaking, it might not be. Setting wise, in terms of its blacks and whites of what's good and bad, it might not be. But in terms of archetypes, it is absolutely perfect because that is what most people imagine, rightly or wrongly, when they imagine an RPG. Therefore, there is grounding. This is why I think alignments are good, because I think alignments provide a nice pair of safety rails, some stabilizers, if you like, for a new role player. It gives direction. It tells them, play in this way. Now, the next game they play may not have an alignment system. It probably won't.
Yeah.
But as an introduction, it is basically an introduction to RPGs. and even the focus on combat, dungeon crawling and combat, I don't think it is actually a bad thing, because that is what most people assume an RPG is going to be. Now, you could argue that's not what we should assume, but accepting the world as it is and D&D having the hugest market share out there, I think that's the reality we have to deal with. So fighting against it certainly doesn't seem to win anyone anything, but finding ways of explaining to D&D players, oh, you like this? Well, here's something else you might like. Not, you like this? I know something better. Or you like this? Well, you're wrong. That's sort of for the birds, you know. There's no, again, there's no victory to be had there. You're just going to make people more dogmatic.
Exactly.
You tell them their tastes are bad.
So we're at time right now. So
we are, aren't we?
I love talking to you. I love like peeking inside your brain, whatever.
And anyone who's ever interviewed me or been in a meeting with me or spoken to me in general will know that I will just keep talking unless someone stops me. So it's probably for the best that you call time.
So where can people find you, and what projects do you currently have coming up?
Well, I've mentioned most of my projects, but yeah, look out for Curseborne in October, as if anyone tuned into Corbin's channel won't already be doing that. So, first of all, you can find me on MatthewDawkins.com. Most of my credits are listed on there. There's over 100 games, and if you buy a book through my website, you may be able to get a discount. I think you should be able to, but regardless of that, I will also get a cut. So I appreciate it when people do that. Just look on my resume. There are a lot of books there with a lot of links. I've worked on a lot of games. In terms of things to look out for, you can also, as well as all the Onyx Path games I've spoken about, I recommend people check out Pendragon by Chaosium, because I am working on a Pendragon book right now, and that has been a great deal of fun. I also recommend Cult Divinity Lost by Helmgast, because I was working on a book for Cult recently, which will be coming out relatively soon. And finally, if you're more of a board game enthusiast and you do love your World of Darkness, check out Vampire the Masquerade Chapters or Werewolf the Apocalypse Retaliation, because I co-authored both of them and I'm very happy with them. So, yeah, there's some things you can check out or look forward to.
Awesome. I'll definitely will be checking that out. Also, reminder to the audience that Curseborne's crowdfunding Kickstarting is coming up in October. If you're catching this after that, I hope it did really well with the crowdfunding. And Storypath Ultra the core manual is currently crowdfunding on BackerKit.
So which family are you, Corbin?
Oh, my wife and I both did the trivia, did the quiz, and we both came up as Reeves.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a bit bloody, isn't it?
And I like the Hydes, though, so maybe I'll go Hyde.
The Hydes are a family who I think on appearances are one of the more antagonistic playable options. And I like that. I'm very happy with Curseborne having some families that are less palatable than others. I don't think they all need to be of the same moral standing. And the Hydes and the Sphinx, I would say, for the Primal, are probably, maybe even the Eight Hands, are pretty horrific in the way they treat their own. But every lineage has a black sheep or two or three to pile all of their sins on. I mean, there's a reason there's a family called the Iscariots in the Hungary, and it's not because they're popular.
Awesome. I can't wait for it. And thank you so much for joining us. Bye. I'm very bad at the outros. Bye.